can show to the government or an organization and say, I am a refugee. If the individual does not have this document, they are not a refugee. So who needs a refugee status recognition document? If it's a SAR, a constituent group or a co-sponsor working with a SAR, they do not need refugee status or a refugee status document. If it's a group of 5 or community sponsor, they need a refugee status document and refugee status unless they are Syrian or Iraqi. So how does somebody get refugee status and also a refugee status document? They can get it one of 2 ways. The first is an interview with the country they are currently in, or an interview with UNHCR. So in some countries, the government conducts the refugee status determination process itself. In other countries, the government delegates that duty to UNHCR. So you go to the UNHCR website and they'll tell you which countries conduct the refugee status determination process themselves and which countries UNHCR conducts the refugee status determination process. In some countries, nobody conducts it because the government has not authorized UNHCR to operate there, and they're not a signatory to the 1951 Convention. The second way of getting refugee status is through prima facie recognition. This is used in situations of mass displacement where there is not enough time or resources to conduct an interview with every individual coming to that country. So since September of last year, Syrians have been recognized by the Canadian government on a prima facie basis. So if you are a Syrian national and you come to Canada, you will be granted refugee status on account of your nationality. Since 2012, Syrians have also been recognized by UNHCR as on a prima facie basis, and up until the middle of 2012, Iraqis were recognized on a prima facie basis by UNHCR, but they no longer are. In order to get prima facie recognition, you must have an immutable characteristic that you share with a larger group. So for example, it may be nationality. In some cases it could be gender. It could be ethnicity. And prima facie recognition has been used throughout history since the 50s. It was used during the Hungarian crisis, the Vietnam War, when you had the boat crisis in Southeast Asia, and it's been used for Somalian nationals during the 90s, and it's currently being used for Syrians, it was used for Iraqis. Okay, so before we go on to look into some examples of refugee status documents, we're just going to discuss terminology and the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. So if I, along with my family, flee my home and we go across the border to the nearest country, my family and I are not refugees yet. We are known as asylum seekers. It's only once we get refugee status through an interview with the host government of that country, or through UNHCR, or on a prima facie basis, we become refugees. So if I approach the nearest UNHCR office or the local government office and I ask for refugee status, they will register me and they may give me what's known as a refugee registration document or an asylum seeker certificate. These 2 documents are not proof of refugee status. All those 2 documents indicate is that my claim for refugee status is pending and I have not been approved as a refugee. Once I go through the interview process, or I'm recognized on a prima facie basis, I will be given a refugee status document. And it's at that point, me and my family are refugees. If we don't get a positive outcome, and we're not granted refugee status because we don't meet the definition of the 1951 Convention, we're known as failed asylum seekers. Okay. So you only get refugee status after receiving a positive outcome, having been gone through the refugee status determination process. So, refugee registration documents and asylum seeker certificates. If the group you're working with is sponsoring a non-Syrian or non-Iraqi national, and they show you a refugee registration document or an asylum seeker certificate, it's not accepted by IRCC as proof of refugee status. As I mentioned earlier, all it shows is that that person's claim for refugee status is pending and they haven't gone through the refugee status determination process. So we're now going to look at some examples of refugee status documents and also asylum seeker certificates and registration documents. So this one is from the UNHCR office in Ankara, Turkey. And I've just expanded the text here, and it says this is to certify that the above named person is an asylum seeker whose claim for refugee status is being examined. This is an asylum seeker certificate, so it will not be accepted by IRCC as proof of refugee status. The next one is from a UNHCR office in Beirut, Lebanon. And it says this is to certify that the above named person is registered with UNHCR pursuant to its mandate. This is a registration certificate, so will not be accepted by IRCC. This is a generic UNHCR template that some offices may use, and it states that the above named persons have been recognized as refugees by UNHCR pursuant to its mandate. This is a refugee status document and it will be accepted by IRCC as proof of refugee status. This is one from the Republic of South Africa, and in South Africa the government conducts the RSD process itself. So if somebody goes through the RSD process in South Africa and they receive a positive outcome, this is what they'll receive. And it states that the person named above has been recognized as a refugee in the Republic of South Africa. So this is a refugee status document and will be accepted by IRCC. It's important to note that they do not look the same. It may be a letter, it may be a card, or it may be a travel document. And the appearance of the documents will vary by country and will also even vary by UNHCR office. So you may have UNHCR Lebanon issuing one type of document, but UNHCR in the DRC is issuing another type of document. If you do have any questions about whether a document is a refugee status document, contact us at RSTP and send us a copy of the document, and we can contact our colleagues at UNHCR and they can check for us whether that document is a refugee status document from that country. So we're now going to look into some recent changes and FAQs. So like I mentioned earlier, Syrians are recognized on a prima facie basis by the Canadian government and UNHCR. So what does that mean for you as lawyers who are offering your time to sponsoring groups to assist with sponsorship? It means that the burden of proof is lowered. All the individual has to prove is that they are a Syrian national, and then they will be granted refugee status. That's more so for the inland process, but it's important to note here as well. So This comes with an exemption, as I mentioned a few times, for Syrian and Iraqi nationals when it comes to refugee status and a refugee status document. And no matter what group you're going through, if you're sponsoring a Syrian or Iraqi, they do not need a refugee status document or refugee status. This was implemented a few years ago, and there have been some indications from IRCC that it will be expiring this year in September. So Syrian national, yes?
Do you need a passport, or what sorts of documents in lieu of passport from your home country?
You would need some sort of identification document, so it could be an ID card, or a passport, or a driving license, or some. You would need some sort of ID card, but you would not need a refugee status card.
If you can't get that?
If you can't get that, then IRCC is still processing applications for Syrian nationals at the moment with missing documentation.
Affidavits to assert that
You could get affidavits, but if you are working with a Syrian national, just send what you have, and IRCC will process it, because they understand because of the displacement situation, people may not have had time to gather all of their documents with them before they left. But that's only for Syrian nationals. If it's a non-Syrian, they will require some sort of identification document. So Syrians can be accessed under the VVOR program by all sponsoring groups. So that includes groups of 5 and community sponsors, as well as SARS. Although SARS can access all nationalities under the VVOR program. So there's been some processing leniency from IRCC with regards to Syrians and Iraqis. So as I mentioned, if you're assisting a family to sponsor a Syrian national or an Iraqi national and there's missing documents, that's okay. Just send the application package with what you have and explain in a covering letter what's missing and what the likely timeline is of obtaining those documents, or whether they can be obtained at all. There's also leniency with regards to photographs, so they're accepting scanned copies at the moment, because they understand that Syrians and Iraqis, they've been displaced, and they may not have the ability to go to a courier company and courier the originals across. They're also accepting scanned application packages. So you don't have to send the application package to IRCC for Syrian nationals via mail. They're accepting them by email. Yes?
So in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where maybe like women would be caught in a situation where they wouldn't have documents, but they provide maybe similar leniency if they were missing like photo identification or any that they just sort of had to flee with the clothes on their back. Like,
unfortunately, it's only for Syrians and Iraqis at the moment. And there is this big emphasis on Syrian nationals, but like you pointed out, there are other refugee populations that have been displaced for a very long period of time, and we are hoping that IRCC implements the processing leniency with those nationalities, but for now, it's just with Syrians and Iraqis, unfortunately. So before March 16th of this year, Syrians were being expedited for processing. Since March 16th, Syrians are no longer expedited. And there's been some indication from IRCC through the media that this will change, it may change, but at the moment, there is no more expedited processing for Syrian nationals. So some frequently asked questions that we have from sponsoring groups about the refugee sponsorship process. Can you sponsor Palestinians who are living in Syria but have been forced to flee Syria because of the armed conflict? This is a very tricky situation because Palestinians, just by the circumstances surrounding their situation, they are refugees having been displaced from Palestine, and they went to Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. So technically, they are refugees. The problem arises with how they get refugee status. So UNHCR will only give refugee status to an individual if they do not fall within the mandate of another UN agency. For Palestinians, you have the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for the Far East, and they are responsible for giving refugee status to Palestinian nationals. IRCC does not recognize refugee status documents from UNRWA at the moment. So if you have a Palestinian national that you're working with for sponsorship, and they have been living in Syria, they may not be eligible for sponsorship. The only exception is if that Palestinian national was born in Syria. If they were born in Syria, Syria gives them a travel document for Palestinian refugees. And it looks like a passport. And that is Syria's way of saying you are refugees. That is their refugee status document. So if an individual that is being sponsored is Palestinian and was born in Syria and has this document, they are eligible for sponsorship. Unfortunately, if they only have a document from UNRWA, then they're not eligible for sponsorship at the moment. We have seen some applications with UNRWA documents go through IRCC and they have been approved, but official IRCC policy is that they will not recognize UNRWA documents. So if you are working with a Palestinian national, just double check what document they have and advise them that they may not be eligible, but you're more than welcome to send the application to IRCC to see what will happen.
Do you know what the reason for that policy is?
I don't know personally, but I could probably take a guess. IRCC only recognizes UNHCR documents because they signed up to the 1951 Convention. UNRWA doesn't have a convention, which it does have a convention, but it doesn't have, it's a very regionalized convention. It's only for the Middle East. So only the Middle Eastern states have signed up to that convention. So yeah, that's my guess for why they're doing it, but we don't know at the moment, and hopefully it will change soon. But at the moment, IRCC will not recognize UNRWA documents. So Iraqis in Syria. During the Iraq War and the aftermath, a lot of people in Iraq fled to Syria, which was relatively stable at the time. And there's still a very large Iraqi population in the east of Syria. And there's been indications from IRCC that they are able to process those applications of Iraqis in Syria. And then when it comes to the interview process, they will have to go to a visa office, be it in Lebanon, Turkey, or Jordan. So it is very difficult, but these applications are going through. What about sponsoring refugees from Europe? So, IRCC considers that, or it views Europe as a durable solution. Because Europe, many European countries, particularly UK, France, Germany, accords the right to work and access to state benefits to refugees that are on their territory. So, with Europe, they also have what's called the Dublin Regulation, or the Dublin II Regulation, which is currently going to become, or will soon become Dublin Regulation 3. And under that agreement, a refugee has to claim refugee status in whichever EU country they arrive in. If an individual does not claim refugee status in that country, so for example, if somebody crosses the Mediterranean and arrives in Rome, they don't claim refugee status there, but they're registered with the police as having crossed the Mediterranean on a boat, but they travel through Europe and go to the UK and claim refugee status in the UK authorities will return that individual back to Rome and back to Italy. Because that individual, under the Dublin regulation, should have claimed refugee status in that country. So if you are working with somebody that does have somebody in Europe that they would like to sponsor, it's likely that they've gone through that European country's refugee status determination process. If it's a positive outcome, they are not eligible. If it's a negative outcome and they're a failed asylum seeker, what we recommend you do is include a copy of the refusal letter from the government within the application package and explain in the cover letter why refugee status was refused. So they may not have had access to adequate legal representation. They may have been confused about the entire process. Some European countries don't have a particularly fair refugee status determination process. So explain that in a cover letter if they did go through the RSD process and they were refused. In terms of the Dublin regulation, if they arrived through one country and traveled to another country, but they were returned to the first country, IRCC will probably reject the application on the basis that they will expect that refugee to approach the authorities of the first country for acceptance within their refugee status determination program. So Europe is tricky, but don't be disheartened if you do have somebody that's in Europe. Include a copy of the refusal letter if there is one. If there isn't, advise them to approach the government of the country they're in and go through the inland processing that that country offers, because a lot of European countries are recognizing Syrian nationals on a prima facie basis. So all they would have to establish is their nationality. So sponsoring Syrians and Iraqis from Gulf countries. Within the United Arab Emirates, unless you're a citizen, your authority and your permission to remain in the UAE is tied to your work permit or your study permit. So there are a lot of Syrians and Iraqis at the moment in the UAE that are working, but their leave to remain is tied to their work permit. In that situation, the refugee would be eligible for sponsorship if they could demonstrate that their work permit is about to be revoked or it won't be renewed. Some UAE countries have started revoking work permits of Syrian nationals and will soon start deporting those nationals to Syria. So if you could demonstrate to IRCC that there is no durable solution for those individuals in the UAE and that there is a threat of refoulement to Syria, then they would be eligible for sponsorship. And the way you would do that is getting a statement from the refugee in the UAE, getting a copy of the letter from their employer that tells them their refugee status will soon be revoked, or sorry, their work permit will soon be revoked, and also a copy of their work permit, because a lot of them have expiry dates on them. And then you would include country condition information on the situation of workers in the UAE and how their status is attached to their work permit. Okay, so before we go into application forms and processing, does anybody have any questions on what we've covered so far? So just to give you an overview of the application process. Once you've worked with the sponsoring groups with completing the forms, and once the refugee applicant has completed the forms, you would put the two sets of forms together and you would send them via mail or email, in the case of Syrian nationals, to the Central Processing Office in Winnipeg. Once it gets to CPAL, they will conduct checks on the sponsoring group to see whether they are eligible for sponsorship. They will check to see if all the documents that are requested by IRCC are within the application package, and then if everything is okay, they will send the application electronically to the visa office that is responsible for the country the refugees are currently in. Once it gets to the visa office will invite the refugees in for an interview. They will conduct the interview. They will see whether their story matches up with the story that they provided in the application forms. And if they successfully go through that interview, they will then conduct the admissibility checks. So the medical check, security check, and the criminality check. Once that's completed, and if everything is okay, they will then refer the case to the International Organization for Migration, and the IOM will arrange travel for the refugee family to Canada. So before we go into the application forms and the application package, we're going to look to see who can be included within a single application package. So IRCC has a definition of a family, and only the individuals that satisfy that definition can be included. So within IRCC's definition of a family, you have the principal applicant, maybe a mother or a father. You have the principal applicant's spouse and common law partner. And then you have any dependent children that are under the age of 19. So that is IRCC's definition of a family, and that is who can be included on one application package. In terms of eligibility and admissibility, only the principal applicant has to satisfy the eligibility criteria. So it's only the principal applicant that has to prove that they are a refugee or they fit the country of asylum definition, that they left their home country, that they're unable to go back, and they're able to establish themselves in Canada. Everybody, however, has to satisfy the admissibility requirements. So everybody has to pass a medical check, a security check, and a criminality check. In the situation where you have children that are over the age of 19, they cannot be included on the same application package as the rest of their family. They would have their own application package. So for example, if you have a family of 3, you have the father as the principal applicant and his wife, and then you have one child that is under the age of 19 and 2 children that are over the age of 19. For that family of 5, you have 3 separate applications. So the first application will cover the mother, father, and child under the age of 19. The second one will cover the first child over the age of 19. And the third application will cover the third child over the age of 19. Okay. And we'll look into how you link those applications later on. But you would link those applications on one of the forms, and IRCC will process everybody within that family together so that they will hopefully arrive in Canada at the same time. In terms of who should be the principal applicant, we recommend that it's always the person with the best refugee story. So in most cultures, the male head of the family will always be put down as the principal applicant, but he may not have the best refugee story. So when you're advising and working with the sponsoring groups, try to get some information about what happened to each of the individuals. So what happened to the husband, what happened to the wife, and then advise the sponsoring group and advise the refugee family on who you think should be the best principal applicant. So whoever has the best refugee story. And in some cases, most cases, it may be the spouse of the person that the family themselves would have put forward as the principal applicant. So always check to see who has the best refugee story before you put down somebody as a principal applicant. So what about de facto dependents? De facto dependents can be included on an application package, but they need to demonstrate that there is some sort of emotional or financial dependency on the principal applicant and his family. So for example, you may have a child whose parents were killed or missing, and he's been living with his uncle or aunt for the last few years or months. In that situation, there is a clear emotional and financial dependency on the principal applicant. So he would be able to be included. In another situation, you may have the elderly mother of the principal applicant or the elderly father. They're not able to work anymore, they're very old, and they rely on their son or daughter for financial support and subsistence support. They can be included, yes.
Do they have to be connected by blood, or can it be someone that they adopted into the family?
Ideally, there has to be some sort of connection, but if it's the neighbor's child who has been taken in by a family, they can be included, as long as they demonstrate that there's no other family members that are able to provide them with the support they're receiving from the refugee family that's being sponsored. So for de facto dependents, you would have a separate sponsorship package for them. They cannot be included on the application package of the principal applicant. And then you would link the two applications together, and I'll show you later on how to do that. It's important to note that the de facto dependent must satisfy the eligibility criteria and the admissibility criteria. So, in the case of a non-Syrian or non-Iraqi, the de facto dependent must have a refugee status document and refugee status. That does get difficult with minors because UNHCR typically accords refugee status to the parents, and the minors come under in on that. So in that situation, you would try to get a copy of the parents' refugee status document, or if you are unable to, you would explain in a cover letter, possibly with an affidavit from the principal applicant, stating what happened and how the minor's refugee status was tied to his parents. Okay, so we're now going to look into the application forms. There's two sets of forms that need to be filled out. There's the forms for the sponsors and the forms for the refugees being sponsored. So if you're working with a SAR or a constituent group or co-sponsor of a SAR, these are the forms you need to fill out. You have the document checklist, the undertaking/application to sponsor, the sponsor assessment, the settlement plan, and the use of representative form. If they're working with a legal representative, or they would like somebody to be a representative.
Are we going to have these slides available?
I have handouts for everybody. Yeah. And all these forms are also on the RSTP website. We always keep the latest version of the forms on there. So if you go to rstp.ca/application forms, you'll be able to find the latest version of these forms broken down by various sponsoring groups. So if you're going through group 5, you complete the document checklist, undertaking/application to sponsor, the sponsor assessment, the settlement plan, and the financial profile. Everybody in a group of 5 needs to complete the financial profile form, and I'll talk about the exceptions to that in a few slides. And then also the use of representative form if they are working with a representative. So for community sponsors, you have the document checklist, the undertaking application to sponsor, the sponsor assessment, settlement plan, and the use of representatives. So we talked earlier about linking, or I mentioned earlier about linking applications in the situations where you have a de facto dependent or you have children that are over the age of 19. So on one of the forms, the undertaking/application to sponsor, under section F, you are able to link those applications. So, for example, if this was the application form for the principal applicant, you would list the de facto dependent or the child over the age of 19 on this form. And then for the de facto dependent or the child over the age of 19, you would list the name of the principal applicant on the other side of the family under this section. On the same form, under section E, sponsors are required to indicate whether the family members coming to Canada will be accompanying or non-accompanying. And this is for situations where you have families displaced over several countries. So you may have a father and one child in country A, then you may have the mother and the remaining 2 children in country B. So what you would do is, if this was the father's application, you would list everybody else in that family on this form, and then you would tick accompanying or non-accompanying. For the ones that are not in the same country as the principal applicant, always tick non-accompanying. Because if you tick accompanying, you're lowering, the processing of that person's application will be held up while the other application is being processed. So tick accompanying or non-accompanying. We have seen some situations where people have ticked accompanying even though they're not in the same country, and those applications have gone through IRCC, but official IRCC policy is that if they're in a different country and they form part of the same application package, tick non-accompanying.